Howdy everyone. Okay, you can see now that I have the blue tape back on the trailing edge. Again, this is done just like I had done it before. Stick the tape on one side, put the leg down on a known flat surface, hold it nice and flat, hold the trailing edge tight to itself, and then wrap the tape around and cinch it all down so the leg is flat, untwisted, and the trailing edge is taped to itself. Next thing to do after that is you take your hinge and cut it to length. The instructions tell you to cut it a couple of inches longer than the leg itself, just so you have something that you can clamp the hinge with. You have enough hinge material sticking out that you can clamp it. There is plenty of hinge material, so I go more like 3 inches longer than the leg itself, just to give me some extra clamping space if I need it. After the hinge is cut, oh yes, be sure to remove the hinge pin. You don't want to cut the hinge pin yet. Just cut the two halves of the hinge longer than the leg, and then you can reinstall the pin. The next thing to do is to draw a center line on each leg of the hinge. So you can see here I've got my center line here. You can see it on this end as well. You want to do that on both hinge pieces. So on the back, the other side of the hinge also has a center line reference here and here. You want to draw that center line the entire length of the hinge. Don't do just the ends. Do that center line all the way down the entire hinge on both hinge halves, just like this, all the way down. So now this is where it gets kind of tricky, and I don't know how much I'm going to be able to explain here in one shot because it looks like this battery's getting weak. So here's what I do in a nutshell. With the trailing edge taped together, I lay the hinge inside the leg and I run the hinge down into the trailing edge until the knuckle is basically nested in the wedge. You don't want to force the hinge into the wedge so that it tries to force this apart. You just want it to come down into the trailing edge wedge here, the knuckle of the hinge, into this wedge till it just nests. You don't want to force it so that it spreads anything apart, and then clamp it. And then you do that same thing on the other end, of course. You do the same thing on this end where you want to make sure that this is taped, and then you want to run the knuckle of the hinge down into the wedge area here until it just touches. Again, you don't want to spread the trailing edge apart, and then clamp it. And I go back and forth between the two ends multiple times. I'll nest this hinge into place, clamp it. I'll go down there, nest it, clamp it, and I'll come back up here and check it, maybe adjust it, reclamp it. So now at this point, it's a matter of personal preference, really. At this point, you want to take the hinge and you want to slide it away from the wedge and then reclamp it. When you take the hinge, you slide it away from the wedge and clamp it, that's going to open up a gap between the bottom of the leg and the bottom of the hinge. If you can imagine bringing the hinge way up here and clamping it, now you're going to have this big gap here. It's the same idea. What will happen then is you will attach the hinge to this half, you'll attach the other hinge half to this bottom piece, and then you'll have to physically smush the gear leg to itself to get the hinge pin in. That smashing of the gear leg will close up this trailing edge gap and hold it nice and tight. So it's just a matter of how much squish do you want. The further aft you run this hinge, or the further away from the wedge you clamp the hinge, the more you're going to have to compress it to get the pin in. And this will make more sense when you go through it and you see what I'm talking about. So for me, I just back the hinge out until there's not quite an eighth of an inch. I think eighth of an inch is a little too much, but something under an eighth of an inch gap, roughly. And then I'll reclamp the hinge. So like I said, this is nested into the wedge. The next thing that I need to do now is figure out how far out I want to pull it and reclamp it. Let me do that, and I'll get back to you here in a second. Howdy, everyone. So I've moved the hinge now, and what I had done before I moved the hinge, when the hinge knuckle was nested down inside the trailing edge here, I made a reference on the gear leg in line with the center line of the hinge. And then you can see now that I've moved the hinge away from the trailing edge about an eighth of an inch. And I've basically done the same thing on this other side. I made the mark. Maybe you can see it better this way. I made the mark here when the hinge was nested, and then I brought it out away from the trailing edge about an eighth of an inch. So what that does now, so now you can see, hopefully, I know the lighting blows. There's a gap now between the bottom knuckle and the bottom of the gear fairing. And what will happen is this bottom hinge leaf will be riveted to this bottom edge here of the gear leg. And in order to pull the two halves together to get the hinge pin in, you'll have to squeeze this. So you can see now that if I squeeze the top and bottom together so that the fairing lays on the knuckle, you can see how much I have to squeeze that. Hopefully that's in focus. But the point that I'm trying to make is whatever you squeeze down here, that's going to help hold the trailing edge together here. So again, you can imagine if you take the hinge and you shove it way forward, if you take the hinge and you bring it way forward, you're really going to have to pinch a lot to get the hinge pin into the hinge halves. So that seems to work good for me. Again, I know I keep repeating myself, but it's very critical. The hinge knuckle gets nested down inside the trailing edge without spreading apart the trailing edge. And then you make a reference, or at least I like to make a reference line on the leg itself in line with the center line of the hinge. Now I can unclamp it and I can move it however much I want and try to move the other side the same amount. Now it's not critical as long as it's close. You really don't want this hinge down close to the trailing edge and on this side have it, way up here somewhere. It's not that critical. I kind of like to let things lay where they want to lay rather than forcing them to go where I think they should in most cases, because that just induces stress. And something like this with the fiberglass, you don't want it cracking, so try not to put a lot of stress in it while you're doing the build. So again, I've got about an eighth inch. I've moved the hinge about an eighth inch on both ends. I'm going to remove this line and I'm going to remark it in line with the new position of the hinge. And then I'm going to connect the dots yet again, and that is going to be where I actually drill. Just as a side note, like I said, I've got the other leg already done. It's over there in place. So I nested the hinge, I made my mark, I moved it away from the mark about 1/8 of an inch and reclamped it. Then I took a measurement from the trailing edge to the center line of the hinge in its new location. I did that on both sides. And then I compared that measurement to my finished gear leg, and it's almost exact. So I'm very confident that this is going to work just as good as it did on that leg. And if anybody cares, again, it really shouldn't matter that much, but if anybody cares, if they walk up on my airplane and can see the rivets, this line of rivets is going to be spaced from the trailing edge the same amount as that leg. So for those that care, you know, this hinge line won't be an inch from the trailing edge, and then they go over to the other side and look, and it's only a 1/2 inch. Does it matter? Doesn't really matter to me. But it is nice just as a double check that since they're so close to one another dimensionally, I think this is going to work out just fine. So I am going to remove this line. I'm going to remark it in line with the hinge line, and then I'm going to make my line across the entire length on both sides so that I can go ahead and drill. I take that back. Let me start over. I'm going to remove the line, this reference line that is no longer valid. I'm going to make a new line in line with the hinge on both ends, and I'm going to connect that line. I'm going to connect those ends with a line, and that's where I'm going to drill for this half of the hinge. Do not do anything with the other half yet. You have to do these one at a time. So I'm going to do this one first. I'm going to completely mark it, drill it, countersink it, and rivet it before I do anything with this other hinge half, and that will become apparent here shortly. So I hope that all makes sense. I don't know how else to explain it, but that's what I do, and that seems to work. So let me get this one squared away, and I'll get some holes drilled, and I'll talk to you guys later.